is it a musical, Cats? Yeah.
Yes.
God.
It's not considered,
No.
it's not a play, it's a musical. They sing in that one, right?
That's all.
My
Okay.
God.
I
That's all
really don't like musicals, so that's why I don't know it better.
Well, that's it. Game over. Can't be friends anymore. We're done.
Okay, here's my promise. If we can get this podcast to 100 subscribers, we will release a special episode where Laura and I just try and explain the plot of Cats to Sarah.
Oh God, don't subscribe then. Get out. Don't subscribe. Don't follow. Get it.
Unding
Sarah's
that
been
bell.
waiting for
Do
this
not
I don't
one.
do that
Right.
at all.
So excited. She's always wanted to hear two nerds talk about the plot
No.
in loose quotes of Cats.
If
This
I
is
have
gonna
to do
be-
that, we better get to 1 million subscribers.
That's going to be our Patreon content. It's just us
Yeah.
explaining musicals to Sarah.
No.
I can't.
I don't want to
wait.
do that ever.
I can't wait. 3 women? Talking about politics?
Hey, organizers. As a heads up, this episode was recorded on November 2nd, before they announced the end of the government shutdown. But the information is still really good, so we thought it was still worth putting out. Happy listening. If democracy had a group chat, this would be it. Welcome to Organizing Chaos with Roots to Results. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to unpack the chaos that is politics in 2025 through an organizer's lens and give you the tools you need to do something about it. I'm Meg Simons, Creative Director at Roots to Results, and I'm here with our amazing, impeccable co-founders, organizers, and all-around political badasses, Laura Miranda Brown.
Hi.
And Sarah Virgo.
Hi.
It's time to talk about America's favorite dysfunction, the government shutdown. At this point, the American government has been shut down for so long, I half expect to see Tom Hanks chatting with a volleyball on the Senate floor every time I turn on C-SPAN. So, what is a government shutdown? Who caused it? And what does it mean to shut down something as big as the American government?
A government shutdown really is just what happens when Congress can't agree on a budget or a temporary funding bill to keep federal agencies running. So without that agreement, which is what's referred to as appropriations, the money will stop flowing, and most parts of the federal government are forced to pause operations. How this actually impacts people depends on what services you're actually dependent on or participating with. You could be a person that depends on Head Start for early education for your toddler. You could be a person that depends on SNAP benefits for food, WIC for certain supports for infants. You could also be a person that likes to go to national parks and visit national museums and things like that. All of those things are impacted when a government shuts down.
And what about all of the federal government employees? Can you explain what being furloughed actually means for people who might not know?
Yeah, furlough is basically when employees are sent home without paychecks and almost always without benefits. If you're thinking of this like a breakup, they're put on pause until there are funds available and checks are coming in and everything is kind of back to normal. It feels like you are being fired.
Yeah, and I can actually speak to this personally. My wife has been, up until very recently, a Department of Defense worker for at least a decade, and she was furloughed a couple of times. And it's kind of terrifying. Like, you just suddenly, the income that you depend on to do things like pay your rent or pay your medical bills or anything like that just suddenly stops. People work for the government because they believe in serving the people, because they're called to civil service, but you take a pay cut to serve your country and to serve the American people. So when that income suddenly stops, it's really scary.
So normally, historically, during a government shutdown, the parties would still be in Washington, D.C., talking about how they could possibly find a middle way through. Like, the Republicans have decided they're not even going to be open. The House of Representatives is not there. They're home in their districts hanging out. I don't think they've been there since mid-September is the last time I think they were there. September 19th, I think. Like, how do you entice the opposing side to come and join you if you're not there.
Right.
So I just want to make sure I have this straight. The people who do things like run our national security, take care of our national parks, make sure our federal employees get paid, our military members, they're not getting paid. But the Republican Congress people who are currently sitting on their hands doing jack all continue to get paid.
Right. I think that's what's really telling right now is that there are a lot of people who have really just checked out and don't care, and they are no longer willing to be held accountable by their constituencies. And that's troubling to me because there are so many people in Congress right now that are not showing up and not available and have turned off their voicemails and their phone systems and just don't really care. And it's very clear. And they were elected to do this job. As a former elected official, there is a responsibility that you take on when you are in that position. And everyone right now has really just checked out. And it's infuriating because there are people across the country who are suffering real consequences.
So I'm going to say something that's going to sound like cold and heartless, right? Because we've just talked about how painful the shutdown is for all of the thousands upon thousands of government workers and then the small businesses and everybody else who's affected by the government shutdown. But I am going to say that I am actually glad the Democrats are refusing to go along with the Republican majority, right? It's miserable that everything is shut down. That's a real seventh circle of hell moment. And nobody needs this chaos. But to see the opposition party, the Democrats, who have a very limited number of tools available to them, finally do something to stop this mess that Trump and the Republicans are wreaking throughout the nation, it's actually kind of giving me some hope. I get it. Hope, cringe, yuck. But it's true. When you aren't in power, sometimes the best thing to do is do what my friend Shoshana Hecht says. You drop the rope, right? You can't carry it all by yourself, so you have to let go. And if you are not in a position of authority, you really have to let go sometimes and let the people who are in charge suffer the consequences. The Republicans control all of the government, and they should be offering solutions to entice the Democrats to join their side to get their votes. That's what the Democrats have historically done. The governing party has the responsibility to actually govern. In addition, I think the Dems are showing incredible message discipline. That is something they are not good at normally. But for the first time in a long time that I remember, they're all saying the same thing. We won't allow for the American people to be hurt anymore. That is incredibly cogent messaging to cut through all of the noise and the chatter. We will no longer allow Americans to bear the brunt of this administration, right? They're standing in the breach so that the people who rely on the healthcare exchanges don't face healthcare cost increases that far outstrip inflation or any other economic measure we normally use. Democrats have been the party of healthcare for all. We've campaigned on healthcare for more than a decade, probably almost 20 years now. Obama's signature win was the ACA, which we'll remember was watered down over and over and over again to try and do what? Oh, right. Entice Republicans to vote for it. This is what we have stood on, and it's a successful political issue for the party, but more importantly, it's the morally right thing to do.
And if I've been reading the headlines correctly, they've made this one intentionally more painful, right? Because in the past, things like SNAP benefits have been paid. But the Trump administration has now intentionally decided not to pay those benefits for shits and giggles because they like seeing children starve. What is the point there?
Yeah, historically, you would never see a scenario where SNAP benefits were held. This is for the purposes of our discussion here. SNAP benefits are commonly referred to as food stamps, EBT. You may hear that. It's basically food to feed people who don't have enough income to buy food on their own. People are suffering, and there are incredible consequences for millions of Americans.
So I have a slightly different take on this. Obviously, the more cynical of the two of us. I actually think two things are happening. I think most Republicans are under the impression that their voting base won't be impacted by these cuts in services, by SNAP benefits not being paid, and all the like, right? I think they're so blinded by the donor base, which is very, very wealthy, that they seem to forget that the people on the ground at home are the beneficiaries. So I think that's number one. Number two, I also think at a administrative level, the Trump administration actually wants people to suffer. They want the average American to question whether or not it's even worth having a government, right? Because if you sow so much chaos and you can't see what is the root cause of the mess and all you see is the fallout, you start to blame anyone and everything. And you think to yourself, why bother paying taxes? Why should we even have a government at all if it can't do this basic stuff, right? You can seed a lot of distress and despair this way. And so why should anyone care if we suspend elections when the government doesn't bother working anyway? It's not worth doing it anymore because it doesn't work. I think there's some of that to this. I'm going to sound like I wear a tin hat at night and that I'm a complete conspiracy theory nut job. And I respect that that is somewhat what this sounds like, but it really isn't. I think the cruelty is part of it. I think the desire to undermine norms and kindness, right? And care for your neighbor and your community so that we stop trusting each other, so that we stop learning to depend on each other, to isolate us further and make it easier for the worst authoritarian tendencies of this administration to firmly take root.
I agree with everything you're saying, Laura. And I think this is really a war on people living in poverty. This is a war on what the Trump administration considers, less desirable people. This is a war on migrant populations that are here. And I actually would argue that the Republican electeds do know that these things will impact their constituents. They just don't care. Millions of people will be without healthcare, without food, without basic things that everyone should be entitled to. And for people who think that government is not supposed to protect its residents and feed the hungry and allow people to be the best that they can be, that's simply not true. I'm going to use my mother as an example with the healthcare negotiations. Pre-Affordable Care Act, my mother was a person who made too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but did not make enough money to buy her own private insurance. Private insurance for a lot of people is a real luxury. It is not something that they can afford. And I'm not talking about like getting insurance through an employer. I'm talking about just purchasing healthcare insurance coverage from a healthcare insurance provider. She couldn't afford that. It's an insane amount of money. At the time, it was more than she was paying in rent. She couldn't afford it. She got really sick in December of 2007, I guess. And we kind of thought it was a flu. It wasn't something critical, but she got, she wasn't well. She ended up, this was a local rural kind of health center area. She went to the hospital. They, of course, are in some circumstances and in most circumstances are required to treat people who are acutely ill. But what they usually do will say, okay, you need more diagnostic testing. We're not going to do that here, which is what happened to her. She then was sent to other places to say, make an appointment for a colonoscopy or an endoscopy. She had some GI issues. You call those places and it's, yes, sure, we can get you in. You don't have health insurance, so we can get you in for $32,000 or $22,000 or whatever insane amount. It might as well be $35 million, right, for someone on a fixed income. This went on for a couple of months, and she was unable to get the diagnostic care that she really needed, and she continued to be sick. Like, she was just getting worse and worse. GI issues were continuing, still could not afford to get that coverage, and had to work for everything that she was paying out. So she was working as much as she possibly could, but she was very ill. And in April of 2008, she had gone to the hospital, by the way, by ambulance. Like, she was trying everything to just get in. In April, she passed away. And this was, again, before the Affordable Care Act, but she passed away. And after we were done sort of figuring out what actually happened, she was severely dehydrated. To fix that issue would have been very simple and very low cost. But there were no protections in place for someone like her, and she died. So when people ask me, what did your mother pass away from? I usually say she was just too poor. She was too poor to afford health coverage. After the Affordable Care Act was enacted, these things were put into place where they protected people like her, where if you make too much money, you can obtain insurance through other avenues that are it's truly more affordable. And she would have absolutely taken part in that. But before that, and what they're advocating to return back to in this situation, people like my mother will die. And so it really is life or death. So Laura, when you're talking about like holding firm. And Meg, you're saying that we have to stay in this. I completely agree, because it's not just one party kind of being stubborn. It is one party saying this is important and millions of Americans will die without these protections. So I offer that just to put a little bit of a real life example to some of these large terms that are being thrown out. This is the kind of impact that it will have on people if these protections are done away with.
To come back to the shutdown idea and the fact that people are actively suffering because of policy choices, the government shutdown is another one. This is a choice that is being made by the people who are in power. The Republicans control 3 branches of government, and they have made the decision that instead of governing, which is what they were elected and hired to do, they're going to sit on their hands and play the victim.
Yeah. And speaking of playing the victim, we're seeing Republicans, and especially the Trump administration, try and blame the shutdown on Democrats in a really unprecedented and creepy authoritarian way. If you actually go to federal government websites right now, like the Department of Justice website or the USDA website, there are banners at the top of the websites blaming Democrats, specifically Democrats, for this government shutdown. I just want to remind people that that's bananas. Like, that's fully bonkers. That's not a thing the government normally does. It's like a mind-boggling departure from how the government has functioned in the past. Let's just address this kind of idea head on. Why aren't Democrats just caving to Republicans' demands? What do Republicans even want to reopen the government for?
Easiest way to think about it is that this budget is the budget that reflects the priorities of the big, beautiful bill, right? This is the funding mechanism by which they will enact all of the changes that were passed into law by this Republican-controlled government, which means it's all of the cuts nobody wanted. It means it's the prioritization of the wealthiest amongst us at the cost of the least amongst us.
I mean, I think a lot of this is around healthcare, right? The Republicans are pushing for major cuts to healthcare, things like rolling back Medicaid expansion and ACA subsidy extensions, which I'm happy to give you kind of an overview of what those things are. But on the Democrat side, the lists of wants and quote demands, they're looking to protect that ACA coverage and subsidies and maintain Medicaid, so preventing its interruptions, preserving rural care funding, restoring full Head Start services, which Head Start is pre-K, funding the federal workforce pay and protecting employees, protecting WIC. But in terms of healthcare, where a lot of the debate has centered with Medicaid expansions, I'm going to try to be really brief in explaining this, but Medicaid expansion is basically, it's a program that lets low-income adults qualify for free or low-cost health coverage under the Affordable Care Act. So it's what's made coverage possible for millions of people who previously earned too much for traditional Medicaid, but too little to afford private insurance. And this is millions of Americans.
I just want to remind everyone that shutdowns are choices. They are political choices by those in power. Mm-hmm. And so we've all heard, I already feel yes, I agree with the Democrats' choice to not give their votes to a funding mechanism, to a budget that would hurt lots and lots of people in America. But it is a choice, right? It's a choice that's being driven by Republicans refusing to negotiate in good faith. And I think as much as the Republicans are trying to make it about Democrats holding the bag, we're not going to let them.
Yeah. I think this whole thing, it weakens democracy and it intentionally normalizes chaos, which shouldn't happen. I also just from a political economic standpoint, the spending doesn't really stop. It stops in that, yes, the money isn't hitting the accounts it's supposed to hit, but those bills are due later. And we actually end up paying more to restart operations, to process backlogs, to cover overtime for people who are still working. So it's not fiscal discipline, it's expensive theater, chaos, and it's choice. So Democrats holding firm and saying we are not going to accept this, it's really important right now.
Bottom line, everything is terrible and Republicans are causing a national nightmare. What do? How do we survive the government shutdown and hopefully make sure this shit stops happening?
Well, I always think the very first thing to do is to call your representatives. Call them. I don't care where you live. Call them and tell them either, yes, congratulations, Democrat, you still have my vote. Keep pushing. this is too important to give up on. Or if you are represented by a Republican, call them and say, hey, hello, could you please come back into session and start working for me? Because otherwise I'm going to go shopping for a new candidate.
Laura, I want to engage, much to Sarah's chagrin, I'm sure. I want to engage in a little theater exercise with you. I'm gonna channel my character of someone who is burnt out on calling their senators real quick and say, I call my senator all the time and they never listen to me. So why should I even keep calling?
That's a great question because it still matters because they're still logging every single email. And for
Ooh, bad news, folks. That sound means we went over our 20-minute limit for the podcast today. But we promised you 20 minutes, and we're only giving you 20 minutes. If you want to hear the rest of the podcast episode, check out the Cut for Time sections on our social media feeds. And until then, go outside, touch grass, and remember, the group chat is only a part of the movement. See you next week.